The city of Vael'Sorrin had not known fear in 3 generations, and it had forgotten how to be grateful for the reason. It rose in 9 white tiers against the coast of a cold sea, each tier a ring of towers taller than the last, so that from the harbor the whole capital looked like a wedding cake carved from moonstone and set down at the edge of the world. The Ansari people who lived there were beautiful in the way of things that have never been tested, long-limbed, silver-eyed, their skin faintly luminous in the dark like the underside of certain leaves. They wrote poetry about the sea and duels about the poetry. They held a festival for the first frost and another for the last, and between the two they argued, exquisitely, about which of their noble houses had contributed most to the peace. None of them liked to speak the true reason the peace had lasted. The true reason was a young man who lived in a bare room above the eastern gate, and his name was Cael Ardyn, and he was human. He was 26 years old. On the morning this story begins, he was awake before the bells because he had always been awake before the bells. Sleep, for him, had long since stopped being a country he could stay in and become instead a border he crossed and recrossed. He sat on the edge of a narrow cot with his forearms on his knees and looked at his hands in the gray light. They were a soldier's hands, scarred across the knuckles, the left one missing the top joint of the smallest finger, a Thren boarding axe 6 years ago, the night he had held the harbor mouth alone until the tide turned. He flexed them slowly. They still worked. That was the only question he ever really asked of his body anymore, and so far the answer had not changed. His armor stood in the corner on its wooden frame, and even empty it seemed to be watching the room. It was not beautiful armor. The Ansari made beautiful armor, thin, chaste, silvered, meant to catch the light during processions and to buckle the instant anything struck it in earnest. Cael's armor was the color of a storm cloud, and it was ugly, and it had saved his life more times than he could count. He had made most of it himself, in the years after they had stopped issuing him anything, hammering plates in the forge below the gate while the smiths pretended not to watch him work. Every dent in it was a night the city had lived through without knowing it had been in danger. There were a great many dents. There was a discipline in the way he looked at it each morning, and the discipline was this. He made himself remember, every single day, that the armor was a tool and not a self. It was a thing you took up when the work required it and set down when it did not, the way a fisherman takes up and sets down his net. He had watched men forget that distinction, in the long years watched them become their armor, until there was nothing left inside the steel but the steel, and he had promised himself, in the cold, clear way he promised himself things, that he would not be one of them. He did not yet know how completely the city would test that promise. He did not yet know that the day was coming when the only way to keep it would be to set the armor down for good, in front of all of them, and walk away as bare as the day they pulled him from the sea. He only knew, that morning, that the steel was a tool, and that a man who forgets he is more than his tools has already lost the war that matters most. He did not put it on yet. He washed his face in the basin, and ate the bread and the hard cheese that a kitchen girl named Sela left outside his door each morning without being told to. She was the only one in the palace who did that, and he had never learned why, and he had never asked, because he was afraid that if he asked she would stop. He drank water. He looked out the narrow window at the harbor, where the fishing boats were going out under a sky the color of a bruise, and he counted them, the way he counted everything, because counting was how he had stayed alive. 41 boats, the same as yesterday, none missing, no gap in the line where a gap should not be. Then the bells rang, and Cael Ardyn put on his ugly armor and went down to keep them safe again. It had not always been this way. He had come to Vael'Sorrin as a boy of 15, half-drowned, the sole survivor of a human colony ship that the Thren had gutted 3 systems away and left to drift. The Ansari had not rescued him out of kindness. An Ansari trade cutter had found the wreck and stripped it, and the captain, a minor nobleman named HFY, had taken the boy along the way one might take an interesting piece of salvage, a curiosity for the court, a story to tell at dinner. The human child, look how small. Look how it flinches. The Ansari had never met humans before. They had heard of them the way one hears of a distant, disreputable family, a young species from a cruel and crowded world, short-lived, quick to anger, absurdly durable, dangerous in ways that made polite people uncomfortable. The rumor was that humans could not be reliably killed. The rumor was that they kept moving after they should have stopped. The court of Vael'Sorrin found this delicious and appalling in equal measure, and for the first 2 years Cael was a pet, then a novelty, then, as novelties do, an inconvenience. What changed everything was the Thren. The Thren were the reason the Ansari built their cities on cliffs and their towers so tall. They came from the deep dark between the stars, a carrion people who did not conquer so much as consume, and they had been circling this stretch of coast for a century, testing it, tasting it, taking a fishing village here and a lighthouse there, and withdrawing before the Ansari could muster the courage to respond. The Ansari response to the Thren had always been the same: a beautiful poem, a beautiful surrender, a beautiful arrangement of tribute. They called it diplomacy. The Thren called it feeding. The night the Thren came for the eastern harbor in earnest, Cael Ardyn was 17, and he was the only person in the city who had ever actually seen the Thren do what they did, because he had watched them do it to his own people. While the Ansari nobles debated the correct form of the tribute, the boy took a boarding pike from a rack no one was guarding and went down to the water alone. They found him at dawn, standing in the shallows among the dead, still holding the pike, so covered in black Thren blood that at first they thought he had been painted for a funeral. He had killed 9 of them. The harbor chain was still up. The city was still standing. He was 17, and he did not seem to understand why everyone was staring at him, and when the old marshal asked him how, the boy said only, "They stop if you make them stop." Nobody was making them stop. That was the beginning of the peace. And that was the beginning, though no one understood it yet, of the debt. For 9 years now, Cael Ardyn had made them stop. He had rebuilt the harbor defenses with his own hands, and taught a generation of Ansari youths to hold a line, though their parents disapproved of the coarsening influence, and pulled most of them back into the salons before the training took. He had learned the Thren, their tides, their hungers, the particular greasy stillness of the sea in the hours before they surfaced, the way a farmer learns weather, until he could feel a raid coming 2 days out and no one could tell him how he knew. He had stood in the water 40 more times. He had a scar for most of them. He had grown from a strange, durable boy into a strange, durable young man, and somewhere in those years the court had performed a quiet, collective act of forgetting. They had forgotten that they were afraid, and then they had forgotten why they had ever needed him, and finally they had begun to resent that they still did. Gratitude is heavy. It was easier to decide he had never earned it. By the time this story begins, the fashion at court was to regard the human as a slightly embarrassing relic, a reminder of a frightened age the Ansari had supposedly outgrown. The young nobles, who had never seen a Thren and never would if Cael did his work, spoke of him as a kind of trained animal. Useful, yes, in its way, but coarse, humorless, a little frightening, faintly disgusting in the manner of all useful things that involve blood. They had a word for him now in the drawing rooms. Translated loosely, it meant the butcher of the gate. They said it fondly, the way you might name an ugly dog. They said it to his face sometimes and watched to see if he understood, and he always understood, and he never let them see that he did. He had made himself very good at not letting them see. On the morning the bells rang and Cael went down in his ugly armor. He was going down not to fight but to attend a hearing, which was worse. 3 weeks earlier, a Thren scouting pack had come up under the 4th pier, and Cael had known it was coming, had felt it in the sea for 2 days, and had gone to the harbor council to ask that the fishing fleet be held in port for a single night. It was a small thing. It was the smallest thing he ever asked. 1 night. The council had refused because Lord Vael'Sorrin, the same Vael'Sorrin who had pulled a half-drowned boy out of a wreck 11 years before, grown now into a sleek and powerful man with a seat on the council, and a grievance he had never named, had said, in his smooth and reasonable voice, that the humans' premonitions were superstition, that they made the city look weak and provincial to its trading partners, and that he for one refused to let a hired killer's nervous stomach dictate the movements of free Ansari. The council, flattered to think of themselves as brave, had agreed. The fleet had gone out. The Thren had taken 2 boats. 11 Ansari had died in the water, and Cael had gone in after them and pulled 6 living bodies out of that water with his own 2 hands and killed the Thren that had them. And it had not been enough, because it was never enough once you were already reacting instead of preventing, and he had known that, and he had said that, and they had not listened. And now there was to be a hearing, but the hearing was not about the 11 dead. The hearing was about Cael. Lord Vael'Sorrin had brought a formal complaint before the council, that the human had, by his fear-mongering, sown discord in the city, that he had exceeded his station by presuming to instruct free nobles on the movements of their own fleet, and that his continued presence at the gate, armed, watchful, ugly, a walking accusation, had become an insult to the dignity of Vael'Sorrin. They had killed 11 of their own people, and they were going to hold a hearing about whether the man who had warned them was too rude about it. Cael understood this. He understood it completely. He walked down the spiral of the eastern tower with his helmet under his arm and his boots ringing on the white stone, and he understood it the way you understand cold water, all at once in the body before the mind has words. He did not feel rage. That surprised him a little on the stairs. He had expected rage and found instead something quieter and much heavier, something that had been settling in him for years and had only now finished settling, like silt at the bottom of a still glass. At the foot of the tower in the shadow of the arch, the kitchen girl Sela was waiting for him. She was younger than him, 17 or 18, thin, her hands red from work, her hair tied back with a strip of rag. She was not supposed to be there. Servants did not loiter in the noble tiers. She stood pressed into the shadow with her back to the cold stone, and when she saw him she stepped out, and her face was frightened, and she said, in a rush, before her courage could fail, "They mean to strip you of the gate. I heard the understeward say it. They mean to give the harbor to Lord Vane's guard and send you to the low quarter. Please," she stopped. She had run out of the sentence. She tried again. "Please don't let them make you small." Cael looked at her for a long moment. She was the only person in 9 years who had ever said please to him about anything that was for his sake and not their own. "I won't," he said, and then because it was true and because she deserved the truth, "but I won't fight them for it either." She did not understand that yet. She would. He set his helmet under his arm, and he went in to be judged by the people he had spent his whole young life keeping alive. The council chamber of Vael'Sorrin was a room designed to make a man feel his own insignificance, and it succeeded on everyone except the one man who had stopped noticing rooms years ago. It was a great white dome, ribbed with silver, and the light came down through a lens of pale blue glass at its apex, so that the whole chamber swam in a cool underwater glow. The councillors sat in a curved tier of 9 high seats, and below them, on a floor of black stone polished to a mirror, stood whoever had been summoned to answer, and the black floor was cunningly made, so that the accused always saw himself reflected upside down beneath his own feet, a small dark figure hanging over an abyss. Cael stood on the black floor and did not look down. He had been here before. Lord Vael'Sorrin rose from his seat with the unhurried grace of a man who has already won and merely wishes to enjoy the formality of it. He was handsome in the cold Ansari way, silver-eyed, robed in the deep blue of his house, and when he spoke his voice filled the dome like water filling a bowl. "We are gathered," he said, "to consider a matter of dignity." Cael let the word settle. Dignity. 11 bodies in the harbor, and they had come here to talk about dignity. For 11 years, Lord Vain went on, this city has extended its hospitality to a creature not our own. We took him in as a child from charity. We fed him. We clothed him. We gave him a purpose and a place and a station far above his origins. He turned slowly to include the whole chamber, and his voice warmed with the pleasure of his own reasonableness. And how has he repaid us? With fear. With grim faces and dire warnings and the constant, wearying insistence that we are always on the edge of ruin. He has made himself the shadow at every feast. He has taught our children to flinch. He has made the free people of Vael'Sorrin afraid to sail their own sea, on the strength of feelings in his stomach that he cannot explain and will not defend. A murmur ran the tier of high seats, agreement mostly. Cael watched their faces and counted out of habit, 7 who agreed, 1 who was asleep, and 1 at the far end, old Marshal Threa, the last soldier left on the council, the woman who had asked him at 17 how, who was looking at him with an expression he could not read and did not trust himself to hope about. The recent tragedy at the 4th pier, Lord Vain said, and here he lowered his voice into a register of manufactured sorrow, is precisely the danger I speak of. 11 of our people are dead. A terrible thing, a grievous thing. He paused. And already the human is using their deaths, their still warm deaths, to say I told you so, to demand that we cower in our harbors at his command, to make himself indispensable through our grief. He looked down at Cael, and something moved behind the silver of his eyes, something old and personal that had nothing to do with the council or the fleet or the 11 dead. I have watched this creature make himself the master of our fear for 11 years. I say the time has come to be free of it. I say we do not need him. I say we never did. And Cael Ardyn, standing on the black mirror with his ugly helmet under his arm, understood at last that this had never been about the fleet, or the pier, or the dead. It had been, from the very first day, about a boy who had pulled a nobleman out of the sea, and then had the poor manners to survive. There is a particular kind of silence that falls when a room has finished deciding, and Cael knew it well. He had heard it in war councils and in sick rooms, and once, long ago, on the deck of a dying colony ship. It was the silence of a verdict that only awaited its words. The old Marshal Threa rose from her seat at the far end of the tier. She was the eldest of them, her silver eyes gone milky at the edges, her hands knotted with age. And when she stood, the whole chamber quieted, because whatever else they thought of her, she had held a line herself once, before any of them were born, and the memory of it still gave her weight. I have a question for the accused, she said, before we vote. Lord Vain inclined his head, gracious in victory. Of course, Marshal. Threa looked down at Cael, and for a moment there was nothing in the chamber but the 2 of them, the old soldier and the young one, across 60 years and a gulf of blood. They are saying, she said slowly, that we do not need you, that the peace would hold without you, that your warnings are superstition and your presence an insult. She paused. You have not spoken in your own defense. You have not spoken at all. A man defends himself, Cael Ardyn, when he is falsely accused. So I will ask you plainly, and I will ask you to answer plainly in front of all of them. Are they right? Do we need you? It was, Cael understood, the only honest question that had been asked in that chamber all morning, and it had been asked by the only person in it who was not afraid of the answer. He looked up at her. He was aware of Lord Vain watching, of the 7 agreeing faces, of the sleeping counselor and the blue underwater light, and his own small inverted reflection hanging beneath his boots. He thought about the 11 dead in the harbor. He thought about the 41 fishing boats he had counted that morning, none missing. He thought about a kitchen girl in a shadow saying, please, don't let them make you small. And he found that he was, at last, very tired. No, he said. The word dropped into the silence and did not echo. Marshal Threa's face did not change, but something in her eyes went very still. No, Cael said again, and his voice was quiet and level, and it carried to every seat because everyone had stopped breathing. You don't need me. Lord Vain is right about that if nothing else." He turned his head and looked at Vain directly, and Vain, who had expected pleading or fury and had prepared himself for both, was not prepared for this. A city doesn't need a wall until the night it does, and on the nights it does, it needs it very much, and there is no time then to build one. But on all the other nights, the 1,000 quiet nights, a wall is just a thing that stands there, ugly in the way of the view. I have been the wall. You are right that on most nights a wall is not needed. You are only wrong about which night this is. He let that sit. No one moved. "I could tell you the tide is turning," he went on. "I could tell you what I feel in the water, that there is something in the deep off the eastern shelf that I have never felt before, bigger than a raiding pack, patient, that has been gathering for a season while you argued about my manners. I could tell you that the 2 boats at the 4th pier were not a raid. They were a taste. Something is deciding whether we are worth the effort, and it has been watching how we answer. And this morning it is watching a city put its only soldier on trial for the crime of noticing." He shook his head once slowly. "But I have told you things like this before, 40 times, and you called it superstition, and you were alive to call it that only because I was right. So I won't tell you again. You've decided you don't need me. I believe you. I'm too tired to argue with a thing everyone in this room wants to be true." Lord Vain recovered himself. He had won after all. The human was conceding. This was better than he had dared hope. "Then you admit." "I admit nothing," Cael said, and for the first time there was an edge in it, thin and cold as a filleting knife. "I concede everything. There's a difference, though I don't expect you to feel it." He turned back to Marshal Threa, and his voice gentled, because she at least had asked honestly and deserved an honest end. "You asked if you need me. The truth is you needed me 9 years ago, and you got me for free, and you spent 9 years teaching yourselves you hadn't. That's done now. You can't unneed a thing you've already decided to despise. So no, you don't need me, not anymore. You've made sure of it." The chamber did not understand yet what it had just been given or what it had just lost. They heard concession and thought it was surrender. They were relieved. Somewhere in the tier of high seats, a counselor smiled. Only Marshal Threa understood, and she sat down very slowly, like a woman lowering herself into cold water, and she did not smile at all. "Then it is settled," Lord Vain said, spreading his hands to the chamber, and his voice rose with the pleasure of a man collecting a long-awaited debt. "The human is relieved of his post at the eastern gate. The harbor defense passes to the household guard of my own house, who are trained soldiers of proper blood and will discharge the duty without theatrics or fear. As for the human himself," and here he could not quite keep the relish out of his voice, "let him take a room in the low quarter, and be grateful, as he was taught, for the hospitality of his betters." There was a scattering of assent. It was done. 11 years of it done in a morning. Cael Ardyn stood on the black mirror for one more moment. Then he did a thing that no one in that chamber ever forgot, though it would be years before most of them understood what they had seen. He set his ugly helmet down on the black stone floor. He did it gently, the way you set down something that has served you well and is tired. The sound of it, the soft grind of steel on polished stone, was the loudest thing in the room. And then, without haste and without a word, he began to take off his armor. He unbuckled the gorget at his throat and set it beside the helmet. He unstrapped the pauldrons, one and then the other, and laid them down. He worked the buckles of the breastplate, the storm-gray plate with 100 dents in it, each one a night the city had lived through, and he lifted it over his head and set it on the floor of the council chamber. And beneath it, he wore only a plain sweat-stained shirt, and the councillors saw, for the first time in years, that the butcher of the gate was only a young man, lean and scarred and unbearably ordinary, and that he had been carrying all of that steel on his own 2 shoulders the entire time. He took off the vambraces. He took off the greaves. He unbuckled the sword belt last, and this he did not drop. He laid it down with a care that was almost tenderness, the long knife he had carried into the water 40 times, and he did not look at it again. When he was done, there was a small mountain of storm-gray steel on the black floor of the council chamber, and a young man in a plain shirt standing beside it, and he had never in his life looked less like a monster or more like a warning. "It's yours now," he said quietly to no one, to all of them. "The gate, the harbor, the peace, all of it. You said you didn't need me to hold it, so hold it." And he turned, and he walked out of the council chamber of Vael'Sorrin, past the 9 high seats and the blue underwater light, out through the great doors and into the pale morning, and he did not once look back, and he left every piece of his armor lying on the floor behind him like the shed skin of something that had decided at last to stop. The chamber was silent for a long time after the doors closed. Then someone laughed, a young counselor, nervous, releasing tension, and then they were all talking at once, relieved, congratulatory, a little giddy, the way people are when a long-dreaded thing turns out to be nothing at all. Lord Vane accepted their congratulations with grace. Servants were summoned to clear away the pile of steel. A steward suggested, to general amusement, that it be melted down for coin or hung in the low quarter as a curiosity. The human had gone quietly. There had been no rampage, no threat, no ugly scene. He had simply given up, as tired creatures do, and slunk away to the low quarter to be grateful. It was, everyone agreed, a very satisfactory conclusion. It was almost anticlimactic. Only Marshal Threa did not join the talk. She sat in her high seat and looked at the empty doors through which the young man had gone, and then she looked at the armor on the floor, and she was old enough and had bled enough to feel the cold that no one else in that bright chamber could feel yet. That a wall does not argue when you tear it down. It does not warn you twice. It simply stops standing between you and the thing on the other side, and the thing on the other side does not care about your dignity at all. She rose, unnoticed in the celebration, and made her way slowly down from the tier, and she crossed the black floor to where the armor lay. The other counselors were flowing out now, toward wine and vindication. She was alone with the steel. She bent with difficulty and laid her old hand on the breastplate. It was still warm from his body. She counted the dents with her fingertips, the way she had once been taught to count the graves in a field, and she lost count, and she understood then fully what the city had done. It had not banished a man. It had disarmed itself and called the act a triumph. "Fool children," she whispered. She was not sure whether she meant the council or herself, or the whole beautiful, unbloodied city that slept on its cliffs and thought its peace was a thing it had earned. Down in the harbor, the tide was going out. And far beyond the eastern shelf, in water so deep and cold that no Ansari ship had ever sounded its bottom, something ancient turned in its patience and felt the wall stop standing and began, without haste and without mercy, to rise. Cael Ardyn walked down through the white tiers of Vael'Sorrin in his plain shirt, and the city did not know how to look at him. He passed nobles who had crossed streets to avoid him for years, and now they did not know whether to sneer or to stare, because a disarmed man is neither a threat to be avoided nor a servant to be commanded. He is simply a person, and they had forgotten he was one. He passed the training yards where, long ago, he had tried to teach their children to hold a line, and the yards were empty now, gone to weeds, the practice posts rotted through. He passed the shrine to the first frost, where the young people left ribbons and love notes, and none of them looked up as he went by because he was nobody now, and nobody is invisible. He felt, walking, an unfamiliar lightness. It was not happiness. It was the specific and disorienting lightness of a man who has set down a weight he has carried so long that his body had reorganized itself around it, so that now, without it, he did not quite know how to stand. 11 years. He had been 15 when they gave him the first pike and told him, without ever saying it in words, that keeping this city alive was now his entire reason to exist. He had believed them. He had made it true. And they had taken it back this morning in the time it takes to drink a cup of wine, and the strangest part, the part he kept turning over as he walked, was that it had not felt like losing. It had felt like waking. He thought, as he descended, about the word they used for him in the drawing rooms, the butcher of the gate, and he found that it had lost its power to wound him somewhere on the council chamber floor, along with the armor. A name is a leash, he understood now, and a leash only holds a thing that consents to wear it. He had worn theirs for 11 years because he had believed, in the deep unexamined way a rescued child believes, that he owed them the wearing of it. He did not believe that anymore. They had cut the leash themselves this morning, thinking they were cutting him down, and a man who has been cut loose is not diminished. He is simply free, and free is a dangerous thing to make of someone you have spent a decade teaching to despise you. He came at last to the lowest tier, the 9th, where the white towers gave way to the working city, the tanneries and the net lofts and the crooked lanes that smelled of fish and smoke and living. This was where they meant to send him. He did not mind. He had never been comfortable in the high tiers. The beauty up there had always felt to him like the beauty of a thing preserved in ice, and he was a creature of blood and salt. And here, in the low quarter, at least the people had the honesty of their hunger. He found a room over a net maker's shop, and the net maker, an old man who was too poor to have learned to despise the human and too tired to start now, gave it to him for a fair price and asked no questions. And Cael sat on the floor of the little room with his back to the wall, in his plain shirt, with no armor and no post and no purpose, and for the first time in 11 years he had nothing at all that he was supposed to be doing, and he did not know what to do with his hands. He was still sitting there when the knock came at the door, soft and quick, and he knew before he opened it who it would be, because there was only one person in the entire city who would come looking for him now that he was nobody. Sela stood in the crooked lane with the dusk behind her, out of breath, her red hands twisting the strip of rag from her hair, and her face was white. "You have to come back," she said. "No," Cael said gently, "I don't." "Not to them." She shook her head hard and her voice cracked. "To me, to us, to the low quarter," she swallowed. "The fishers are talking, the old ones, the ones who have been on the water their whole lives. They say the sea is wrong. They say the fish have gone, all of them, out past the shelf, gone in a single tide like the water emptied out. They've never seen it, not once in all their years." She stared at him, and her frightened young eyes searched his face for the thing she needed and dreaded to find there. "You know what it means. I can see that you know, please. What does it mean?" Cael stood very still in the doorway of his bare little room, and out past the harbor mouth, past the eastern shelf. He felt it too, had been feeling it since the council chamber. A vast cold pressure in the deep like the intake of a breath before a scream. And he knew exactly what it meant. And he understood, with a calm that frightened him more than fear would have, that it was already far too late to stop it. "It means," he said, "that the wall came down this morning, and the thing on the other side felt it." The fishers of the low quarter gathered in the net maker's yard that night, because the low quarter had always known, in the wordless way of people who work near death, that the human was the reason they were alive, even in the years when the high tiers had taught themselves to forget it. There were perhaps 30 of them, old men and women mostly, their faces cracked as the mudflats, and a scattering of the young, and they stood in a loose ring under a sky where the stars had come out hard and cold, and they looked at the young man in the plain shirt as if he were the last dry thing in a rising flood. He told them the truth. He had always told them the truth. It was the only currency he had left. "There's a thing in the deep water," he said. His voice was quiet, but the yard was silent, and it carried. "I've felt it gathering all season off the eastern shelf, in water the Thren themselves are afraid of. I don't have a name for it. I don't think the Thren have a name for it either. I think it's the reason the Thren only ever nibbled at this coast and never took it all those years. They were feeding at the edge of something's territory, and they knew it, and they were careful." He paused. "It doesn't have to be careful anymore." "The fish," an old woman said, "the fish are gone. The fish are gone because they're prey, and prey knows before we do." He looked around the ring of frightened faces. When the small things flee all at once, it's because a big thing has decided to move. The fish felt it stir. You felt the fish leave. In 2 days, maybe 3, we're going to feel it arrive. He said it plainly, because these were people who lived and died by the honesty of the tide, and they would not thank him for a comfortable lie. It's coming up out of the deep, and it's coming here, because for 11 years there was a wall it didn't care to test, and this morning the wall came down and it felt that. Things that patient always feel it, when the thing they've been waiting for finally happens. A young fisherman, barely more than a boy, spoke up and his voice shook. Then tell the council, tell the high tiers. They'll man the harbor, They won't, said the old net maker before Cael could answer, and his voice was dry as sailcloth. They spent 11 years learning not to listen to him when he wore the armor and held the gate. You think they'll listen now that he's a beggar in the 9th tier? He spat once in the dust. They'll say the fishers are drunk. They'll say the human is spreading fear again, out of spite, because they took his post. They'll say it right up until the water comes over the harbor chain. He was right, and everyone in the yard knew he was right, and the knowledge settled over them like frost. Sella stood at Cael's shoulder. She had not left it since the doorway, and she looked up at him, and there was a question in her face that she was too proud and too frightened to ask aloud, and it was this: are you going to save us anyway? After everything, are you going to put the weight back on your shoulders and stand in the water one more time for people who put you on trial for warning them? Cael felt the question. He did not answer it because he did not yet know the answer, and he would not lie to her. Here is what I can do, he said instead to all of them. I can teach you. In 2 days I can't make you soldiers, and I won't pretend I can, but I can show you how to bar the low quarter, how to fall back through the lanes so the thing can't flank you. Where the water comes highest and where it comes least, so you put your children where it comes least. How to make it stop wanting you because it can be made to stop wanting you. Everything can, it's just a question of cost. I can't save the city. He let that land, and it was terrible, and it was true. The city decided this morning that it would rather be beautiful than defended. I can't change what they decided, but I can maybe save this yard, this lane, these children. If you'll do exactly what I tell you, and not one thing more, and not argue, because there won't be time to argue. There was a silence, and then the old net maker said simply, "Tell us what to do." And so, in the last 2 days before the deep came up, the strangest garrison in the history of Vael'Sorrin took shape. Not in the white tiers, not at the great harbor with its silvered chain, but in the crooked lanes of the 9th quarter, where a young man with no armor taught fishers and net menders and tannery girls how to survive a thing the high city refused to believe in. He did try. That should be recorded because it matters to the measure of him. On the first day, before he began with the fishers, Cael Ardyn walked back up through the 9 tiers in his plain shirt to the gate of Lord Vane's household guard, and he asked to speak to the marshal of the harbor defense, the officer who now held the post that had been his that morning, and he told him, plainly and without spite, what was coming and what to watch for in the water, and how the harbor chain should be raised and doubled, and where the guard should be placed. He gave away, freely, everything he knew to the man who had replaced him, because 11 Ansari were already dead, and he would not let more die for the sake of his pride. The marshal of Vane's guard, a polished young nobleman named Coran who had never seen the Thren and had gotten his post as a favor and a fashion, heard him out with an expression of increasing amusement, and then he had Cael escorted from the gate. "The council warned me you'd do this," he said, not unkindly, the way one speaks to a madman one intends to be gentle with. "The fear-mongering, the dire warnings. Lord Vane said you'd come crawling back within the day, trying to make yourself needed again. I'll grant you're faster than he guessed." He shook his silver head. "Go home, human. The harbor is in proper hands now, and sorry hands. We don't need your ghost stories." Cael looked at him for a moment, at the beautiful useless armor, at the harbor chain lying slack in the water because no one had thought to raise it, at the fishing boats going out again because no one had thought to hold them, and he felt the last of something in him quietly close, like a door in a house you are leaving for good. When it comes, he said, raise the chain and fall back to the third tier. Don't try to hold the harbor, you can't. Just get the people up and behind stone, that's all. Will you remember that, the third tier? Good day, human, said Coran and turned his back. Cael went back down to the ninth quarter and did not go up again. He had done what a man could do. The rest was theirs. He worked the fishers hard those 2 days. He showed them how to sharpen the long fishing gaffs into something that could open a thren hide, and warned them that the deep thing would not be like the thren, bigger, stranger but flesh in the end, and flesh could be made to stop. He walked the lanes with them 100 times until the fallback path was in their feet and not just their heads, from the yard up the crooked lane, through the tannery arch that only one thing could pass at a time, to the old grain silo of white stone that had walls a man's length thick and a single door that could be barred. That's your keep, he told them. That's where the children go. Everything I'm teaching you is really just about getting to that one door and holding that one door. Forget everything else. Get to the door. Hold the door. Word of the strange work in the low quarter reached the high tiers, of course, as such things do, carried up by servants and traders and the endless gossip of a bored and beautiful city. And the high tiers laughed. They heard that the disgraced human was drilling fishwives with sharpened gaffs and teaching tannery children to run to a grain silo, and they thought it the most delicious thing they had heard in a season. The butcher of the gate, reduced at last to playing soldier with peasants, staging his little pageant of doom in the mud because he could not bear to be nobody. Lord Vane himself remarked at a dinner that it was almost touching, the way the creature clung to its fear now that no one would pay it to be afraid. The whole table agreed and laughed and refilled its cups, and went out afterward onto the balconies to admire the sea, which was, they all remarked, unusually calm that evening and unusually low. He did not sleep. Sella brought him bread and hard cheese, the way she always had, and sat with him in the small hours while he sharpened gaffs by lamplight, and she watched his scarred hands work, and once she said, quietly, "You could just leave. You're free now. There's a caravan road south over the mountains. You don't owe them anything. You don't owe us anything either." She said it as a test, he understood, and also as a genuine offer, because she loved him in the plain, unspoken way of someone who has fed a person every morning for years, and she did not want to watch him die for the 9th time in water that would take him at last. He was quiet for a while, working the whetstone. "I laid down my armor," he said at last, "because they made it a thing I wore for them, a dog's collar, a servant's chain. As long as I wore it, I belonged to them, and everything I did belonged to them, and they could despise me for it, and I'd keep doing it because I'd let them make it my whole reason to be alive." He tested the edge of the gaff against his thumb. "So I laid it down, not to abandon anyone, to be free of them. There's a difference, though it took me 11 years to feel it." He looked up at her. "But being free doesn't mean not caring what happens to people. It means caring because I choose to, not because they own me. I'm not going to stand in the harbor and die for the council's dignity, but I'll stand in this lane for you and for the old net maker who gave me a room and asked no questions, and for the boy whose voice shook in the yard. That's mine to choose now. It was never mine before." Sella did not say anything. She reached out and took the sharpened gaff from his hands and looked at it, and then she looked at him, and something settled in her young face that had not been there before. The specific hardening that comes to a person the first time they understand that they are going to have to be brave whether they feel brave or not. "Then teach me to hold the door," she said. And he did. On the 3rd day at dusk, the sea began to withdraw. It did not go out like an ordinary tide. It fled. The water pulled back from the harbor faster than any tide had ever moved, bearing the black mud of the harbor floor, the drowned rocks, the wrecks of a century, the bones of the sea laid open to the dying light. The fishing boats that had gone out that morning, because Coran had not held them, because no one had held them, were caught on the falling water and dragged out with it, tiny, toward the horizon, toward the place where the sea was gathering. In the high tiers they came out onto their balconies to watch, and they thought it was beautiful, this strange low tide, this bared and silver mudflat glowing under the first stars. Some of them called for wine to watch it by. A poet, it is said, began at once to compose. They did not understand that the sea pulls back like that for only one reason, in the moment before it returns as something else. In the low quarter, the fishers looked at the fleeing water and knew, and they took their children by the hand and began, quietly, without panic, exactly as they had been taught, to move toward the door. And Cael Ardyn stood in the net-maker's yard in his plain shirt, with a sharpened gaff in his scarred hands and no armor between him and what was coming, and he watched the sea gather itself against the darkening sky far out beyond the eastern shelf, a wall of black water rising, and taking on a shape as it rose, a shape that was not water at all. And he felt no fear, only the old cold clarity and one small unexpected grief, sharp as a splinter. That the beautiful city on the cliffs was about to learn, all at once and far too late, exactly what its wall had been for. "Get to the door," he said quietly to Sella, to the fishers, to the children, without turning his head. "Get to the door and hold the door. Don't look at it. Don't look at the city. Just hold the door." The sea came back. It came back as a wall of water 3 times the height of the harbor, and it came fast, faster than anything that size had any right to move, and it struck the harbor of Vael'Sorrin and swallowed it whole, the slack chain, the beautiful useless boats, the guard of Lord Vane's household who had never seen the Thren and now saw, for the first and last time, the thing the Thren had been afraid of. The great wave broke over the first tier and the second, and where it broke, it left the deep thing behind it, riding the flood into the drowning city, and now the high tiers could see it. And now, at last, they understood, and their beautiful understanding came to them in the form of a scream that rose from the whole city at once, from 10,000 throats, up into the cold, indifferent stars. The wall had come down that morning, and the thing on the other side had felt it, and it had come to see whether, without its wall, the beautiful city on the cliffs could hold. It could not. Later, those who survived would try to describe the thing that came up out of the deep, and they would fail, because it was not made to be described by people who lived under a sun. It was pale, the dead white of things that have never needed color, and it was vast, not the vastness of a mountain, which is still, but the vastness of a storm which moves. And it came into the drowned tears of Vael'Sorrin on a body that was many bodies, a nested and unfolding architecture of limbs and mouths that opened where mouths had no business being. It made no sound of its own. The only sound was the city, and the water, and the breaking of white stone that had stood for 300 years and had never, until this night, been asked to stand for anything at all. It went up through the tears the way water goes up, finding every gap, and it fed as it went, and it was not hurried because nothing was left that could hurry it. The beautiful armor of the household guard buckled the instant it was struck, exactly as beautiful armor does. The silvered chain that had guarded the harbor for a century lay under 50 feet of water, having never been raised, because the man who had told them to raise it had been escorted from the gate for spreading fear. Lord Vane died in the 4th tier in the great house of his ancestors, and it is not known how he died, only that he did, and that he had time first. A little time, the reports agree, to stand on his high balcony and watch the thing come up through the city he had disarmed, and to understand in that little time what he had done that morning in a bright chamber under a blue lens of glass, when he had taught a room full of frightened people to call their own defense an insult. Whether he understood it fully or only felt the cold edge of it, no one can say. He had time to understand. Perhaps that was mercy enough, and perhaps it was the opposite of mercy. The sea does not distinguish. But the story of that night is not, in the end, the story of the high tears, though the high tears are what the poets would come to write about, in the long grief afterward, in their beautiful useless verses. The story of that night is the story of one door in the 9th quarter, and the young man in a plain shirt who chose, freely, to stand in front of it. Because the deep thing, in its rising, sent its lesser parts ahead of it, pale questing limbs, each one alone the size of a serpent, each one a mouth, and these went down into the low quarter, into the crooked lanes, seeking the small living warmth of the people who had fled there. And in the low quarter they did not find a beautiful city that had forgotten how to be afraid. They found fishers with sharpened gaffs, standing in a lane that had been chosen for them by a man who understood water and hunger and the geometry of a killing ground, falling back exactly as they had been taught, drawing the pale limbs after them into the one place a thing that size could only come one at a time. They found the tannery arch, where only one could pass, and they found Cael Ardyn standing in the mouth of it, with no armor and a fishing gaff in his hands, doing the only thing he had ever really known how to do, which was to make a thing stop. He had chosen the arch the way a man chooses where to plant a flag. Behind him, up the last stretch of lane, the fishers were getting the children into the old grain silo, through the single door with its walls a man's length thick. In front of him, the pale limbs came down the lane out of the drowning dark, one at a time, because the arch would not let them come any other way, and one at a time was a fight a man could have, if the man was the right kind of man, and if he did not care whether he came out of it. Cael Ardyn had stopped caring about that a long time ago. What he cared about was the door. He killed the first limb in the arch as it came, driving the gaff up into the soft place behind the questing mouth, the way he had shown the fishers, and it thrashed and died, and he dragged the carcass half out of the arch so the next one had to climb its own dead to reach him, which slowed it, which was the whole art of it, the ugly, unbeautiful art he had spent 11 years perfecting while the high tears wrote poems about the sea. He killed the second. He took a wound doing it, a long tear down his side, and he did not look at it because looking at a wound is how you die of it. He killed the third. The arch filled with pale dead flesh and black blood, and still he stood in the mouth of it in his plain shirt, soaked to the skin in the blood of things from the bottom of the world, and he made them stop and stop and stop. And behind him at the silo door, Sela held the door. She had begged to stand with him in the arch, and he had refused, and it was the only order he gave that night that he gave as a command and not a suggestion. "The door is the point," he had told her, gripping her thin shoulders, his eyes hard. "Not me, the door. If the arch falls, everything I'm doing is for nothing unless someone shuts that door and bars it and does not open it again no matter what they hear. Do you understand? No matter what they hear, even if it's me, especially if it's me. You hold the door." And she had understood because he had taught her to understand, and she stood at the silo door with the old net maker and the boy whose voice had shaken, and a heavy bar of ancient wood across her red hands, and she watched him fight in the arch, and she did not run to him, though every part of her wanted to, because he had given her something better than the right to die beside him. He had given her a thing to hold, and a reason, and the terrible clean dignity of a task. That in the end was what he had given all of them, not rescue. He could not rescue them, he had told them so plainly, and it had been true. What he gave them was the chance to survive on their feet instead of dying on their knees, and the difference between those two things is the whole of what a wall is for. For a wall does not carry you to safety. It does not lift you up or bear you away. It only stands in the one place where the danger comes, and it refuses to fall, and it buys you the time and the ground you need to save yourselves. A city that mistakes its wall for a servant, that thinks the wall exists to spare it the trouble of ever being brave, has already begun to die and does not know it, and will not know it until the water comes. The low quarter did not make that mistake. The low quarter knew in its hunger-honest bones that the man in the arch was not saving them. He was only holding the door long enough for them to save themselves, and the saving was theirs to do, and they did it and lived. The high city died screaming that night, beautiful to the last, understanding nothing until there was nothing left to understand with. The low quarter held its door. It cost more than the fishers had words for afterward. Cael Ardyn held the tannery arch for a long time, no one is sure how long, Those who lived through it say time went strange, the way it does in the deep hours of a fight, so that it might have been the third part of an hour and it might have been half the night. He held it while the pale limbs came, and he held it when the deep thing itself, having stripped the high tiers, turned some fraction of its vast attention down toward the one place in the drowning city that was still, infuriatingly, resisting, the one lane that would not scream, the one door that would not open. And the deep thing sent something worse down the lane. Not a limb, a part of itself with intention in it larger, that did not come one at a time because it did not have to. It came filling the whole width of the lane, and the arch would not hold it long, and Cael Ardyn knew, when he saw it come, that this was the 9th time he had stood in the water, and that it was the last, and that he was not going to walk out of this arch on his own 2 feet. He was by every account entirely calm. He looked back once, one look, over his shoulder, up the lane to the silo door where a thin girl with red hands stood ready to bar it. And whatever passed between them in that look, Sela never told anyone, not in all the long years she lived afterward, and she lived a great many. And then he turned back to the thing coming down the lane, and he set his feet in the mouth of the arch, in the blood and the ruin, an ordinary young man with a fishing gaff and no armor and nothing left to prove to anyone living. And he did not run, and he did not kneel, and he made his stand in the one place where his death would buy the most time for the door behind him. "Shut it," he said without turning. His voice carried up the lane, clear and level, the last order he ever gave. "Shut the door, Sela, bar it, now, and don't open it, whatever you hear." And Sela, weeping so hard she could barely see, did as he had taught her. She and the net-maker swung the great door, and it groaned on its ancient hinges, and the last thing she saw through the closing gap was the young man in the plain shirt setting himself in the arch as the thing came, small and unbroken against the vast pale ruin, choosing freely at last, for the first time in his life truly freely, to be the wall. The door boomed shut, the bar came down, and in the deep stone dark of the old grain silo, in the walls a man's length thick that he had chosen for them, 41 people, the same number as the fishing boats, someone would note later, though no one could say what it meant, held one another and held the door, and listened in the dark, to the sound of a young man buying them their lives with the only coin he had ever been permitted to spend. Then the sounds outside stopped, all of them, even the sea. They did not open the door. He had told them not to. They held it, shaking, through the long silence that followed, hour on hour, until the black water withdrew from the low quarter as strangely as it had come, sliding back down toward the deep with whatever it had taken, sated at last, or bored, or simply gone. They held the door until the first gray light came in under it, and then, because someone had to, the old net-maker lifted the bar. Outside, the crooked lane of the 9th quarter was quiet in the dawn. The tannery arch was choked with the pale, dead flesh of things from the bottom of the world, more of them than they could count, a whole slaughtered legion of the deep. The blood had already begun to sink into the mud. Of Cael Ardyn, they found no body. They found the gaff broken. They found a great deal of black blood that was not his, and some that was. They found, driven deep into the keystone of the arch by a hand that must at the very end have had nothing left but its grip, the strip of rag that Sela had used to tie back her hair, which he had taken from her the night before without a word, and which she had let him take without asking why. She understood why now. It was a marker, it was a message. It said, "This is where I stood." It said, "Hold the door." She took the rag down from the keystone with her own red hands, and she tied it back into her hair, and she did not weep again, not that morning, because she had a thing to do that was more important than weeping. She had 40 living people in a silo and a drowned city above her, and a great deal of work between them and the next dawn, and he had taught her, in 2 days, everything she needed to begin. Above them on the cliffs, the white towers of Vael'Sorrin stood broken against the morning sky, silent, emptied, beautiful still and beautiful forever now in the way of ruins, which is the only beauty that lasts. The high tiers had had their dignity. The low quarter had had a door and a man to stand in front of it, and that had made all the difference that could be made. Marshal Threa did not die that night, though she was old and the high tears fell around her, and she had every excuse to. She survived because, alone among the counselors, she had believed the young man in the plain shirt when he laid down his armor and told them a wall does not warn you twice. When the sea began to flee the harbor at dusk, while the others called for wine to watch the pretty tide, the old marshal had already ordered the people of the fourth tier, her own household, her servants, the children of the palace kitchens, down and inward, behind the thickest stone she could find, the deep old vaults beneath the ancestral houses where the wine was kept and the dead were laid. She did not fully understand what was coming, but she had heard, in the council chamber, the specific quality of a soldier's certainty, and she had spent her long life learning to trust that quality when she heard it, even in the mouth of a man she was too proud to defend. So a few hundred lived in the high tiers in the vaults, because one old woman had believed a warning that everyone else had put on trial. And when the dawn came and the black water withdrew and she climbed up out of the vaults into the broken morning, into a city that was no longer a city, she stood among the ruins of everything she had ever known, and she wept not for the towers, which were only stone, but for the appalling arithmetic of it, the whole beautiful arithmetic of it. That so many had died, and it had all been avoidable, and the only thing that had stood between the city and its avoidable death had been a young man they had spent 11 years teaching themselves to despise, and had disarmed in a single bright morning, and had congratulated one another for disarming. She went down through the ruined tiers that first day, an old woman picking her way through drowned splendor because she had heard, the survivors were already saying it in stunned voices, the story passing up from the water's edge. She had heard that the low quarter had held, that there had been a door and a stand and a human in a plain shirt, and she needed to see it. She needed, before she died, to stand in the place where the thing had been stopped, because she had spent her whole life around walls and soldiers, and she knew that such places were holy, and that most people never got to stand in one. She found the tannery arch in the 9th quarter, choked with the pale slaughtered dead of the deep, and she found the fishers cleaning it, grim and quiet and unbroken, and she found a thin girl with red hands and a strip of rag in her hair directing the work with a calm authority that no one questioned, and Threa understood, looking at her, that this was the one he had chosen, not chosen as a lord chooses an heir, but chosen the way a fire chooses the thing it will pass its flame to before it goes out. The old marshal knelt, with great difficulty, in the mud of the low quarter, in front of a girl who had been a kitchen servant a week before, and she bowed her white head, and the fishers went still all around her, because they had never seen a noble of the high tiers kneel to anyone, let alone to one of their own. "I am Threa," she said. "I sat on the council. I did not speak for him. I asked him a question, and he answered it honestly, and I let them tear him down anyway because I was old and tired and afraid of Lord Vain, and I told myself there was nothing to be done." Her old voice did not shake. She had earned the right to say this plainly, and she was going to spend it. "I want to know his name, the one they called the Butcher of the Gate. I want to know the name of the man who died in this arch so that you could live, because we in the high tiers never once used it. Tell me his name, so that at least one of us who let this happen will carry it." And Sela looked at the kneeling marshal for a long moment, and then she told her. "His name was Cael Ardyn," she said. "He was 26 years old. He came here as a boy, half drowned, the last of his people, and you made him your wall, and then you hated him for being a wall, and he let you for 11 years because he thought that was the price of a place to stand." Her voice was very steady and very young, and it carried the whole weight of the night in it. "And then one morning he stopped letting you. He laid down his armor in your council chamber in front of all of you, and he walked away, and you thought he'd surrendered. He hadn't. He just finally decided that his life was his own to spend and not yours to spend for him. And when the deep came up, he chose Do you understand? No one made him. No one could have made him. There was a road south over the mountains, and he knew about it. He chose to spend it here. On us. On a door in the 9th quarter. Freely. For the first time in his life, freely. She lifted her chin. That's the difference you never understood. You thought he served you. He never served you. He only ever chose. And the last thing he chose was us. Threa wept, then openly, the way the old weep without shame, and she stayed kneeling in the mud until Sela, moved despite herself, reached down with her red hand and helped the old marshal to her feet. That was the beginning of the reckoning, and the reckoning was slow, and it was sober, and there was no vengeance in it, because the only person who might have had a right to vengeance had died buying their lives and had spent his last breath telling them to hold a door, not to hate anyone. The survivors of the high tiers came down to the low quarter in the days that followed because there was nowhere else to go. The towers were broken and the vaults were cold, and the low quarter, alone in all the city, still knew how to live. They came down proud at first, expecting to command, because they were nobles and these were fishers, and they found that their titles had drowned with their towers. They found that the currency of the low quarter was not blood or beauty but competence, the ability to mend a net, to bar a door, to stand a watch, to do a hard thing without complaint, and that in this new economy the fishers were rich and the nobles were paupers, and the exchange rate did not care how many high seats a man's family had held. They found, above all, that the low quarter had a leader now, and that the leader was a girl with red hands and a strip of rag in her hair, and that she had been taught by the only person who had ever truly known how to keep them alive, and that when she gave an order, the low quarter obeyed it and lived. And one by one, the proud survivors of the high tiers learned to obey it too, because the alternative was to die of their dignity, and they had had, at last, quite enough of dignity. Sela did not want to lead. She said so more than once in the first hard weeks, sitting up in the small hours the way he had used to, with a whetstone in her hands that she did not need, because working the stone helped her think, the way it had helped him. But there was no one else, and the thing needed doing, and he had taught her that when a thing needs doing and there is no one else, you do not get to want or not want. You simply do it on your feet until someone better comes along, and no one better ever comes along, and that is how the world is held together, not by the willing, but by the ones who understood there was no one else. So she led. She was not gentle about it because he had not been gentle and the times did not permit gentleness. She set the survivors to rebuilding not the high towers, which no one had the heart or the skill to raise again, but the low quarter, wider now, up the slope, stone by stone, a plain and ugly and defensible town where a beautiful and defenseless city had been. She had them raise a wall. A real one, an ugly one, storm gray and thick and utterly without grace, and when a former noble complained that it spoiled the view of the sea, she looked at him with eyes that had watched a man die in an arch, and she said, "A wall is a thing that stands there, ugly in the way of the view. And on the night you need it, you will need it very much, and there will be no time then to build one." And the noble did not complain again, because half the low quarter had gone silent when she spoke, recognizing the words, and he understood that he had blundered into something holy. There were nights in those first hard weeks when the leading of the town felt too heavy to carry, and on those nights Sela would climb the ugly half-built wall alone and sit with her back to the storm-gray stone and look out at the dark sea, and she would talk to him, not out loud. She was not a fool, but in the private country behind her eyes where the dead go on living for those who loved them. She would tell him what she had done that day and ask him whether it was right, and in the silence she would hear his answer, which was never comfort and never praise, only the plain, flat honesty he had spent his life on. "Is it done? Did you do it on your feet? Then it was right." She came to understand on those nights that this was what he had left her, not a memory to mourn, but a standard to be measured against, a hard clean edge she could hold every decision up to for the rest of her days. It was more than most people leave. It was, she thought, exactly as much as a wall leaves. the shape of where it stood so that you know what to build in its place. She kept the rag in her hair for the rest of her life. It became, in time, a thing the town knew: the leader's rag, the marker, the sign of the door. And when at last she was old, older even than Threa had been, and it came time to pass the leading to another, she took the rag from her white hair with her own knotted hands, and she tied it into the hair of the one she had chosen, a young net mender who had the quality she was looking for, the specific stubborn competence that does the hard thing on its feet. And she told that young person the story, the whole of it, the way it had been told to her, so that the town would never forget what a wall was for, or what it cost, or the name of the young man who had been theirs. Cael Ardyn's name did not vanish. That was perhaps the strangest fruit of that terrible night, that a man the high tiers had spent 11 years unnaming, a man they had called the butcher of the gate to his face and watched to see if he understood, became, in the town that grew where the city drowned, the closest thing that plain and ugly and living place ever had to a saint. Not a saint of miracles, a saint of walls. When the children of the new town learned to hold a line, and they all learned, every one of them, girls and boys alike, because Sela had made it law that no child of hers would ever be as defenseless as the beautiful children of the high tiers. They learned it in a training yard named for him, and the first thing they were taught, before they were ever handed a gaff, was the story of the arch and the door. Get to the door, hold the door. It became a saying in the town, and then a saying along the whole coast, carried by traders inland and up the caravan road over the mountains, until people said it who had no idea it had ever been a real door or a real man, said it the way people say all old sayings, meaning, do the thing that must be done, in the place where it must be done, whatever it costs, and do not open the door no matter what you hear. There are worse things for a young man to leave behind him than a saying like that. And the deep thing, it never came again. The fishers watched for it in the years that followed with the particular vigilance of people who have learned the price of forgetting, but the fish came back in time, out past the shelf, and where the fish are, the deep is empty, and so they knew. Whether Cael Ardyn had killed it in the arch, or only heard it, or only fed it enough that it withdrew sated to its cold black country to digest a beautiful city, no one could say. The truth is probably that he did not kill it. A man with a fishing gaff does not kill a thing the size of a storm. But he made it stop. That was the thing he had always been able to do, the thing he had said at 17, standing in the shallows among the dead, when the old marshal asked him how. They stop if you make them stop. Nobody was making them stop. He had made it stop at the last in a tannery arch in the 9th quarter, with the only coin he had ever been permitted to spend, and it had gone back down into the deep, and it had not come again, and the town that grew where the city drowned lived, and its children lived, and their children because of a door and a man and a girl who held it. There were some in the long years after who tried to soften the story into something the high tiers could have lived with, who said that the human had loved the city after all, that he had forgiven it in his heart before the end, that the stand in the arch had been a kind of loyalty. But the ones who had held the door would not have it. They knew the truth was harder and cleaner than forgiveness. He had not forgiven the city, and he had not needed to. He had simply stopped letting it own him, and in that freedom he had discovered that his life was worth spending and had chosen, coldly and gladly, where to spend it. It was not loyalty that put him in the arch. It was choice. And choice, they had learned, standing behind that door in the dark, is a far rarer and far more terrible thing than loyalty, because loyalty can be demanded of a man, and choice can only be given, and a gift given freely by someone who owes you nothing is the only kind that is worth anything at all. The traders who carry the saying inland do not always tell the whole of it, and perhaps that is right. A saying should be small enough to fit in the mouth of a tired person at the end of a hard day. But in the town where it began, they still tell it whole, once a year, on the night the sea ran out, how the proud city called its own shield an insult and put him on trial for the crime of warning them, how he laid his armor down among them and walked out into the morning and left them, at last, to the fate they had chosen with their own eyes open. And how he did not walk south over the mountains, though the road was there and no one would have blamed him, but turned instead down into the mud of the 9th quarter, and gave his one free life to the people who had only ever given him bread. They tell it whole because the whole of it is the only part that matters. A person is measured not by what they endure for masters who despise them, but by what they choose to spend themselves upon once no one owns them at all. He chose a door. He chose the humble behind it. He chose, and the choosing was the whole of his freedom, and he spent that freedom on us. There is a stone in that town, to this day, set into the base of the ugly storm-gray wall, at the place where the tannery arch once stood. It is a plain stone. There is no beautiful verse carved on it, because the town that grew there had learned to distrust beautiful verses, having watched a city write them right up until the water came over the harbor chain. There are only 4 words on the stone, cut deep, the way a man might cut them with the last of his grip into a keystone, and they are the words that the town has said to its dead, and its children and its walls for more generations now than anyone can count. Here the wall stood. Not the wall of stone. The wall of stone came later, and Sela built it, and it was ugly and it held. But the first wall, the true wall, the one the stone remembers, was a young man in a plain shirt with no armor at all, who had every reason in the world to walk away over the mountains, and who laid down the armor they had made into his chains, and became, freely at the last, of his own choosing, the wall. He laid down his armor, and they thought he had surrendered. He laid down his armor, and they left the harbor chain slack, and called their defenselessness a triumph. He laid down his armor and walked out of a bright chamber into a pale morning, and left the beautiful city to the fate it had spent 11 years inviting, and it met that fate and drowned in it, understanding nothing until the end. But he did not leave everyone to their fate. That is the part the high tiers, in their little time to understand, could never have understood, because they had never once in their lives chosen anything that cost them. He left the ungrateful to their fate. And then, having laid down every chain they had ever put on him, standing at last as free as a man can stand, he chose, for a kitchen girl who fed him every morning, for an old net maker who asked no questions, for a boy whose voice shook, for 41 people behind a single door. He chose to stand in the arch and to be the wall, one final time. That is the whole of it. That is what the stone remembers. A young man quietly laid down his armor and left the proud to the fate they had earned, and gave his life, of his own free will, to the humble who never asked him for anything but honesty. The proud got their dignity and it drowned them. The humble got a door and it saved them. And the difference between those two things, the whole terrible, awful difference, was one young man's choice, made freely at the very last, in an ugly arch, with no armor and nothing left to prove. Here the wall stood. And the sea, which takes everything in the end, has never once come back for the town that remembers his name.